All right, so everybody, thanks so much for listening to Fire Breathing Rob. If you're listening to us on one of the podcasting sites, Apple, Spotify, we thank you for that. If you're listening to us on YouTube, we also thank you for that. And if you are listening to us on the radio, we greatly appreciate that rather. And please, tell your friends, family, subscribe, like, share, and get this interview out to as many people as possible. Today we have a special guest on, Charles Dellheim, and he is rather a professor at Boston University. We'll talk a little bit about that, but he is also the author of a new book, Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Rather Modern. So Charles, first of all, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it today.
Very happy to be here, Rob.
All right, so let's kick this around. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about you that I didn't just talk about in the introduction?
Well, these days I like to say that I was a Brooklyn boy before Brooklyn was cool. In fact, well before it was cool. So I grew up in New York City, and I was interested in history and literature from the earliest age. I was also interested in baseball, but I realized before long that I was not going to be playing for any of the New York teams anytime soon. So history seemed like a better bet. I'm not sure that it was, but we'll find out. And I studied modern European cultural history at Yale, and I spent some time in England, and I did a lot of writing about Britain, about culture and politics and business. Everything from Cadburys chocolate and Jaguar cars, or as they would say, Jaguar cars, to Mrs. Thatcher's capitalist revolution. But gradually I drifted back into European cultural history, and I became interested in the subject of this book, which is the backstory of Nazi stolen art.
So, talk about what made you want to write this book in general.
There are times I ask myself just that. I was interested in moving out of British history and doing more with Jewish subjects and themes. And in the late 1990s, there was a dramatic resurgence of interest in the fate of Nazi stolen art. And this resurgence took place 5 decades after the end of the Second World War. And suddenly it seemed that rarely a month went by without articles in the press about one new revelation or another, or about bitter disputes about the ownership of works of art. And I found this story to be incredibly enthralling, partly because I'm the son of a German-Jewish refugee father, and my dad came here to New York, as it happened, at age 15, with his sister, age 16. And the shadow of my family history was always there, and in part probably because my dad, like many refugees, did not talk much about what happened to him and his family in Germany, and it was difficult for him and painful for him. And I guess that made me all the more interested in it. But I'm also a professional historian, and I teach European cultural history. And when this interest in Nazi stolen art surged, I was fascinated by it. I welcomed the long-delayed restitution of famous works of art, like Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, which, thanks to the generosity and wisdom of Ronald Lauder, now hangs in the Neue Gallery in New York City. But at the same time, I had a concern, and the concern was that so much attention was being paid to the fate of these works of art and to the question of restitution that very little was said about the Jewish dealers and collectors who loved and lost these pieces. So what I set out to do was to turn the story of Nazi stolen art on its head. by focusing not so much on how Nazis and collaborators ransacked Jewish-owned collections, but on how certain Jews came to acquire so much great old and modern art in the first place. And what makes this a really interesting story is that these were people who were cultural outsiders, who, against all odds and expectations, suddenly became a critical force in the art world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They became the old masters, new masters, and the modernist champions. And I wanted to know how this happened, and I wanted to know about the people themselves. And I decided to write about a remarkable group of people, individuals and families of Jewish origin, and to look at their rise and fall. So in other words, a kind of epic narrative which stretches from the late 19th century to the present and spans Europe and the United States.
So when you talk about the collection starting really to get pumped up in the 1990s, is this mostly by, people of Jewish descent, or is this some, just people that just, maybe they loved World War II history, or they're just history buffs like, both of us are?
Well, it's an interesting question. The people who are trying to recapture the art are either the people who would once own them or their heirs. And that depends a lot on the age of the dealers and collectors and what happened to them during the war. Tragically, as you know, some of these people were murdered and the art was considered ownerless, though that was simply untrue. And there had been attempts by Jewish individuals and families to recapture the art, but there hadn't been great success. There was a flurry of interest in the recovery of Nazi stolen art in the immediate wake of the Second World War, and there were certainly numerous works of art that were restituted, but there were thousands of works that were not. And what happens in the late 1990s is a couple of things. First, by then, the Holocaust had moved from the margins to the center of public consciousness in this country and in other ways in Europe. Second, there were a lot of revelations about what was called Nazi gold, and in particular about the malfeasance of Swiss banks, which kept the accounts of their Jewish owners and did not restitute them to their heirs. But there was also a change of heart within Jewish communal leadership. After the war, for obvious reasons, the emphasis was upon trying to find homes for displaced persons, for people who came out of the camps, for people who had hidden during the war, some Jews, some non-Jews, and that had to be the emphasis. And while there were some attempts to recapture stolen assets, they were fairly limited. And in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there is a different attitude that these works of art were no longer just a matter of individual property that had never been regained. They were also, as Elon Steinberg of the World Jewish Congress put it, the last prisoners of war. So this is no longer just an individual quest, it's a public quest. And American legal authorities become involved in it, not least in New York City, where the great Robert Morgenthau, who was the heir of a remarkable family, was interested in the issue and made some very courageous attempts to recapture art that was in the wrong hands. But this is also a book that I think, I hope would interest anybody who's interested in European cultural history and in art history. But in particular, the bloody crossroads of art and politics in the 20th century, where culture and barbarism, art and avarice collide with disastrous consequences.
So as we end, can you tell people where they can get the book and follow you, whether it's on social media or if they want to learn more about you,
Sure.
Professor, in general?
I have about 3 copies in my house. No, I'm just kidding. I would say book.org, so you can support your local independent bookstores, which have been pretty hard hit, like many businesses during the pandemic, through the University of Chicago Press or Brandeis University Press. There's always Amazon. To learn more about me, I would say you could call my wife, but that probably isn't a good idea. I'm afraid I am not much of a self-promoter. You can get some information about me on the Boston University website, and I think there's something on LinkedIn. But I've written books about other subjects, and they're out in the world. I'm not sure if they're collector's items or not. That's a different issue. But I hope people will, take an interest in this issue, and also, in the most general sense, to write Jews back into the history of minorities in this country and Europe.
Professor Charles Dellheim, again, definitely check out the book, book.org. I would say too, instead of Amazon, Amazon makes enough money off many different things. Charles Dellheim, again, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it and look forward to doing this again down the road.
It was a pleasure. It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much, and all best to your audience.
All right, thanks so much.